the full history of Atlantis. Tonight, as darkness settles gently over the world, we drift together toward an ancient tale. The lamplight grows soft around us, and somewhere beyond our windows, the night breathes quietly. Let yourself sink into the comfort of your pillow and allow your mind to wander toward a story that is whispered through centuries like waves against a distant shore. This is a tale of Atlantis, that legendary island which rests now only in memory and dream. We will journey through its entire history tonight, from the first words spoken of it in an Athenian courtyard to the gentle seekers who still search for its traces beneath moonlit waters. The story unfolds like a slow tide, carrying us through gardens and harbors, through temples touched by morning light, and into the deep, quiet where all legends find their rest. Close your eyes if you wish, and let the rhythm of this telling carry you. We begin not with the island itself, but with an old man in Athens, a philosopher whose gentle voice first gave shape to this dream that has never quite left the world. The sea keeps breathing beyond every coastline, holding its secrets in the rhythm of waves. And tonight we listen to what it might have witnessed long ago. Before we begin tonight's gentle journey, take a moment to check that you're subscribed so you will never miss the next story. And if you feel like sharing, write in the comments where in the world you are listening from. It is always comforting and beautiful to see how many paths meet here in this quiet space. Plato's whisper. In the soft light of an Athenian afternoon, when shadows grew long across marble columns, an elderly philosopher named Plato gathered his students in a garden courtyard. The air carried the scent of olive, trees, and the distant murmur of the agora. But here in this quiet space, words took on the weight of careful thought. The old man's voice was measured and kind, worn smooth by years of teaching, and when he spoke of distant lands and ancient times, his listeners leaned forward like children hearing their first bedtime tale. Plato had been pondering the nature of perfect societies, the way a city might be ordered if wisdom, rather than ambition, guided its builders. His fingers traced patterns in the dust as he spoke, drawing circles within circles, sketching harbors that existed only in imagination. The students watched these gentle movements, mesmerized by the way abstract ideas took shape beneath his patient hands. It was then that Plato first whispered of Atlantis, though he claimed the story came from older sources, passed down through generations like a treasured heirloom. He spoke of an island beyond the pillars of Hercules, where the western ocean stretched toward unknown horizons. The island, he said, had been larger than Libya and Asia combined, a place where the earth itself seemed blessed with abundance, and the people had learned to live in harmony with both sea and stone. The description flowed from his lips like poetry carefully memorized. 9,000 years before his time, Plato murmured, this island had flourished under clear skies. Its people built their city in rings of water and land, creating canals that reflected the stars and gardens that bloomed in every season. The harbor welcomed ships from across the known world, and the sound of many languages mingled like music in the marketplace. As the afternoon light shifted and cooled, Plato's voice grew softer, more distant. He told his students how this perfect realm had grown proud, how its people forgot the humility that had first earned them the gods' favor. The earth itself had responded to their hubris. He whispered, and in a single day and night of gentle sorrow, the island had slipped beneath the waves, leaving only the memory of its beauty to haunt the dreams of distant lands. The students sat in contemplative silence as their teachers' words settled around them like evening mist. Some wondered whether this Atlantis had truly existed, while others understood that truth sometimes lived more purely in story than in stone. The sea kept breathing beyond the harbors of Athens, carrying away their questions, and leaving only the peaceful rhythm of waves against worn keys. Plato smiled at their thoughtful faces, knowing that the seed of wonder he had planted would grow in different waves within each mind. Some would search for the literal island, mapping currents and measuring depths. Others would find in Atlantis a mirror for their own hopes, a reminder that even the most beautiful dreams must be tended with wisdom and care. The philosopher's words drifted out from that garden courtyard like spores on a gentle wind, carried by merchants and travelers to distant cities. In Alexandria's great library, scholars would copy his dialogues onto papyrus scrolls. In Rome's forums, orators would speak of the sunken realm to illustrate their points about virtue and decay. And in the minds of countless listeners yet unborn, the image of Atlantis would take root, growing into something both more and less than Plato had ever intended. As night fell over Athens, the old man walked slowly home through streets that had heard 10,000 such conversations. The moon cast silver patterns on the stone walkways, and from the harbor came the soft creaking of masted ships resting at anchor. Plato paused to listen to these familiar sounds, then continued on his way, unaware that it just breathed life into a dream that would outlive empires and continue whispering across centuries yet unborn. The sea kept breathing, as it always had, holding in its depths both real islands and imagined ones, both the certainty of tides and the mystery of what lay beyond the next horizon. And in that breathing, in that eternal rhythm, the legend of Atlantis found its first and most enduring home. A day in Atlantis. Morning came to the great island like a blessing, with sunlight spreading across the concentric rings of water that embraced the central city. The canals caught the golden light and held it, creating mirrors that doubled the beauty of white stone bridges and terrace gardens. From the highest tower of the royal palace, one could see the entire realm spread out like a map drawn by gods, with the outer ring of mountains forming a protective embrace around the inhabited lands. The air was warm and sweet, carrying the mingled scents of jasmine and sea salt, of fresh bread baking in countless ovens, and of the strange flowers that bloomed only in Atlantean soil. These gardens were tended by people whose ancestors had learned to coax beauty from the earth through patience rather than force, creating spaces where color flowed like music, and every pathway led to some new wonder. In the market squares that dotted the island's districts, vendors arranged their wares with an artist's eye for harmony. Baskets of fruit glowed like jewels in the morning light. Purple grapes that tasted of summer rain, golden oranges whose fragrance could perfume an entire street, and a peculiar blue, melons that grew nowhere else in the world. The merchants called their prices in voices that sang rather than shouted, for the Atlanteans had learned long ago that beauty extended even to the rhythms of daily commerce. Children played in the shallow channels that brought fresh water from the mountain springs to every neighborhood. Their laughter echoed off stone walls carved with spiraling patterns that seemed to capture and hold the light. Elderly citizens sat in shaded alcoves, weaving cloth from fibers that shimmered with colors no foreigner had ever seen, or carving small figures from the warm amber that washed up on the island's beaches after every storm. The craftsmen of Atlantis worked with a patience that bordered on reverence. In workshops open to the harbor breeze, They shaped vessels from clay that held within its grain the memory of volcanic soils and gentle rains. The pottery that emerged from their kilns was both sturdy and elegant, formed with an understanding of how useful things could also feed the soul. Neighboring artisans hammered sheets of orichalcum, that strange metal unique to their island, creating both tools and ornaments that gleamed with an inner light. As the day progressed and shadows began to slant across the canals, the tempo of the city shifted into the peaceful rhythms of afternoon. Scholars gathered in libraries where scrolls from every known land were copied and preserved, their knowledge freely shared among any who sought to learn. Teachers led small groups of students through gardens where mathematics and philosophy were explored with the same gentle attention given to tending roses or pruning fruit trees. The harbor never truly rested, but even its busiest hours moved with a measured grace. Ships from distant shores dropped anchor in waters so clear that their shadows could be seen wavering on the sandy bottom. Far below, sailors from Egypt and Mesopotamia, from the northern forests and the southern deserts, walked the quays with wonder in their eyes, speaking in whispers of the marvels they had found in this blessed place. Evening approached like a friend long awaited. The sky above the island painted itself in shades of amber and rose, while the first stars appeared like tiny lanterns being lit in heaven's windows. In homes throughout the city, families gathered for the day's final meal, sharing not only food but the stories that had accumulated through hours of gentle living. The conversations flowed like the canals themselves, carrying news and wisdom from district to district in an endless, nourishing circulation. Musicians took their places in the great plaza as twilight deepened. Their instruments, harps strung with wire drawn from island metals, flutes carved from reeds that grew in the sacred pools, drums whose heads were stretched tight over frames of seasoned wood, created melodies that seemed to rise from the very stones beneath their feet. The music was neither urgent nor melancholy, but carried instead the deep contentment of people who had found their proper place in the world. Lanterns began to bloom like flowers throughout the city, their warm light reflecting in the canal waters and creating pathways of gold that led the eye toward distant mysteries. Night blooming jasmine opened its petals to release perfume into the cooling air, while fireflies danced above the fountain pools. Like scattered stars that had lost their way home to the sky, the great lighthouse that stood guard over the outer harbor sent its beams sweeping across waters where dolphins played in the ship lanes and strange phosphorescent creatures painted the waves with trails of blue-green light. This beacon had guided countless vessels safely home, its steady pulse as reliable as the tides themselves, a promise that some lights never failed and some harbors always welcomed the storm. Weary traveler, as the island settled into night's embrace, the canals reflected not only the lanterns and stars, but something deeper. The accumulated peace of a civilization that had learned to live in harmony with both its dreams and its limitations. The sea kept breathing around their shores, the same eternal rhythm that had lulled their ancestors to sleep and would comfort generations. Stone and orichalcum in the workshops that lined the inner canals of Atlantis. The day began before dawn with the soft sounds of preparation. Master craftsmen lit their forges and arranged their tools while apprentices swept the floors and prepared the materials that would be transformed through patient skill into objects of both beauty and purpose. The work proceeded with a rhythm as steady as breathing, each hammer blow and chisel stroke guided by traditions passed down through countless generations. The stone masons of Atlantis worked with materials that seemed to hold light within their very grain. The island's quarries yielded marble that ranged from purest white to subtle shades of gold and rose, each block chosen not only for its strength, but for the way it would harmonize with its neighbors in wall and column. The craftsman could read the stone like text, understanding where natural fissures ran and how. The grain would respond to the patient pressure of their tools. In the largest workshops, teams of masons shaped the great blocks that would become the foundations and walls of public buildings. They worked without haste, understanding that stone gave up its secrets only to those who approached it with respect and patience. The rhythmic tapping of their chisels created a percussion that echoed across the water, a steady music that spoke of human hands guided by artistic vision and practical wisdom. The architects of Atlantis drew their plans with the same careful attention to harmony that their musicians brought to composing songs. Every building was designed to complement its neighbors and to channel the natural flow of air and water through its chambers. Windows were positioned to catch the morning light and frame views of distant gardens or harbor waters. Courtyards were shaped to create gathering spaces where citizens could meet and converse in the shade of flowering trees. But it was in their work with orichalcum that the craftsmen of Atlantis truly set themselves apart from all other metalworkers in the ancient world. This strange alloy, found only in the veins that ran through their volcanic mountains, possessed qualities that seemed almost magical to foreign observers. It was harder than bronze, yet easier to work than iron, and when properly finished, it gleamed with an inner fire that never tarnished or grew dull. The miners who extracted orichalcum from the mountain depths worked in small groups, following veins of the precious metal through tunnels lit by oil lamps whose flames danced in the underground drafts. They sang as they worked, their voices echoing through stone passages in harmonies that made the darkness less profound. The metal came from the earth reluctantly, requiring not only strength but intuition to locate the richest deposits. In the smithies where orichalcum was shaped and refined, the master metalworkers guarded there. Techniques like sacred mysteries. The metal had to be heated to precise temperatures, neither too hot nor too cool, and worked while it remained responsive to the craftsman's vision. Some pieces were destined to become ornamental elements for great temples, their surfaces polished to mirror brightness and etched with patterns that seemed to shift and flow in changing light. Other works in orichalcum served more practical purposes. Tools and weapons were crafted with edges that remained sharp through years of use, while household items, plates and cups, lampstands, and door fittings brought a touch of beauty to the simplest daily activities. The metal seemed to remember the craftsman's intentions, holding its shape and finish with a permanence that outlasted the hands that had shaped it. The construction of the great temples and public buildings required the coordination of many different crafts. Stone masons worked alongside metalworkers, while carpenters shaped the rare woods that grew in the highland forests. Glaziers created windows from glass that had been tinted with minerals, dissolved in the furnace heat, producing panes that cast colored light across interior spaces like permanent rainbows. The most skilled artisans were those who combined multiple materials in single works. Fountains incorporated carved stone orichalcum fittings and glazed tiles that depicted scenes from the islands, history, and mythology. These master craftsmen understood that true beauty emerged not from any single material but from the harmony between different elements each contributing its own qualities to a unified whole. In the smaller workshops scattered throughout the residential districts, individual craftsmen pursued their own visions with quiet dedication. Jewelers set island gems into orichalcum settings that enhance rather than overwhelm their natural beauty. Furniture makers joined pieces of different woods with such skill that their seams were nearly invisible, creating chairs and tables that seemed to have grown rather than been assembled. The guild system in Atlantis ensured that knowledge was shared freely among craftsmen while maintaining the high standards that had made their work renowned throughout the known world. Master artisans took pride in training apprentices who would eventually surpass their teachers, understanding that true craft lay not in hoarding secrets, but in nurturing the growth of skill and vision in the next generation. As evening approached and the workshops began to quiet, the craftsmen would often gather in the courtyards to share the day's achievements and challenges. They spoke in voices softened by dust and warmed by the satisfaction of work well done, their conversations flowing like the canals that carried both water and reflection throughout their city. The tools were cleaned and arranged for the next day's work, while the completed pieces were carried to homes and public spaces where they would serve their intended purposes for years to come. The sea kept breathing beyond the harbor walls, its rhythm matching the steady pulse of creation that filled these workshops day after day. In the sound of waves against stone quays, the craftsmen could hear an echo of their own patient efforts, the endless process of shaping raw materials into forms that would outlast their makers and carry something of their vision into the future. Mariners and beacons, when the sun slipped toward the western horizon and painted the harbor waters in shades of gold and crimson, the mariners of Atlantis prepared their vessels for the night voyages that carried them to distant shores. These were sailors who learned to read the sea's moods as easily as others read written texts, understanding the subtle messages carried in the color of clouds, the direction of swells, and the behavior of the seabirds that followed in their wake. The ships of Atlantis were built with the same patient craftsmanship that characterized all the islands. Works. Their hulls were shaped from timbers that had grown in highland forests, seasoned by alternating sun and rain, until they reached a perfect balance of strength and flexibility. The vessels curved through the water with a grace that made them seem less like constructed objects than living creatures perfectly adapted to their element. Each ship carried within its design centuries of accumulated wisdom about the sea's ways. The placement of masts and the cut of sails took account of wind patterns that mariners had observed across decades of voyaging. Holds were shaped to carry cargoes safely through storms, while living quarters provided shelter, without sacrificing the vessel's ability to respond quickly to changing conditions. Every line and curve had been tested against the sea's judgment and refined through countless voyages. The navigators of these vessels possessed knowledge that seemed almost mystical to landlubbers. They carried no charts in the sense that later ages would understand, but instead held in their minds detailed maps of the ocean's hidden geography. They knew which currents flowed where and when which stars appeared above which headlands, and how the flight patterns of migrating birds revealed the locations of distant islands. As darkness settled over the harbor, the great lighthouse began its nightly vigil. This beacon stood tall against the star-filled sky, its light sweeping across waters where phosphorescent creatures traced patterns like fallen constellations. The lighthouse keepers tended their flame with religious devotion, understanding that lives depended on this signal that helped vessels find their way home through the darkest nights. The lighthouse beam reached far beyond the visible horizon, its light reflecting off clouds to create a glow that could guide ships even when the beacon itself remained hidden by distance or weather. Returning mariners would search for this faint luminescence with the same intensity that desert travelers sought water, knowing that it promised safety and rest after weeks of uncertainty on the trackless ocean. But the great lighthouse was only the most prominent of many beacons that guided navigation around Atlantis. Smaller towers dotted the coastline, each tended by dedicated keepers who understood their responsibility to maintain the network of lights that made safe passage possible. These lesser beacons burned fires of different colors and intensities, creating a coded language that informed approaching vessels about wind conditions, safe harbors, and hazards to be avoided. The harbor pilots who guided foreign ships through the treacherous channels that led to Atlantis possessed an intimate knowledge of every reef and sandbar. They could read the water's surface like an open scroll, seeing in the patterns of waves and current locations of obstacles that would destroy any vessel whose captain lacked their expertise. Their small boats moved through the channel markers with a confidence that came from years of practice and an inherited understanding of the sea's secrets. Night sailing required different skills than daylight navigation, but the mariners of Atlantis had mastered both aspects of their craft. They used the stars as guides, but also relied on more subtle indicators. The sound of waves against unseen shores, the scent of particular flowers carried on offshore breezes, and the behavior of sea creatures whose habits revealed information about depth and current. The songs that Atlantean sailors sang during night watches served purposes beyond entertainment. These melodies carried navigational information encoded in their rhythms and verses, allowing crews to maintain their courses even when clouds obscured the stars. The songs also helped maintain the steady, rowing pace that was necessary when winds failed, turning the mechanical motion of oars into something approaching music. When ships from Atlantis reached distant ports, their arrival was often announced by the distinctive sound of these sailing songs echoing across foreign harbors. Merchants and dock workers would recognize the approach of Atlantean vessels long before they became visible, drawn by melodies that carried with them the promise of exotic goods and tales from the legendary island beyond the western horizon. The cargo holds of these ships contained treasures that made foreign traders' eyes grow wide with wonder. Bolts of cloth woven from fibers that shimmered with colors unknown to other lands, jewelry fashioned from orichalcum and island gems, pottery whose glazes seemed to capture and hold light, and vials of perfumes distilled from flowers that bloomed nowhere else in the world. But perhaps the most precious cargo was the knowledge these mariners carried, techniques of navigation, construction, and craftsmanship that could transform entire civilizations. Return voyages brought equally valuable treasures to Atlantis. The ship's holds filled with spices from tropical forests, amber from northern shores, silver from mountain kingdoms, and most importantly, the ideas and innovations that flow between cultures like streams converging into a great river. The mariners served as conduits for this exchange, carrying not only goods but the stories, songs, and wisdom of distant peoples. As dawn approached and the night watch prepared to end, the returning vessels would appear on the eastern horizon like materializing dreams. The lighthouse beam would sweep across their sails one final time before being extinguished for the day, while harbor bells rang out the welcome that had greeted countless homecomings across the centuries. The sea kept breathing in its eternal rhythm, carrying these Vessels safely back to the harbors where loved ones waited with the patient faith that had sustained. Mariners' families since the first ships had ventured beyond the sight of land. The docks would soon bustle with the activity of unloading, but for now, in the quiet minutes between, night and day, the harbor held a perfect peace. The returned sailors looked toward their island home with eyes that had seen many wonders, but found none to match the simple beauty of familiar coastlines, bathed in the gentle light of dawn, temples and offerings. In the highest district of the central island, where the morning mist clung longest to terraced gardens, and the air carried the perpetual sound of temple bells, the sacred precincts of Atlantis rose like prayers given, form and stone. These temples were not monuments to conquest or displays of earthly power, but quiet spaces where the island's people came to acknowledge their place within the greater mysteries that surrounded all mortal endeavor. The principal temple, dedicated to Poseidon, stood at the island's heart, its columns rising toward the sky, with a grace that seemed to flow naturally from the earth itself. The building had grown over centuries, each generation adding to its beauty, without disturbing the harmony of the original design. Morning, light filtered through windows positioned to illuminate different chambers as the sun traced its daily path, creating an ever-changing interplay of brightness and shadow that reminded visitors of the constant movement within apparent stillness. The priests and priestesses who served these temples moved through their duties with serenity that reflected years of contemplation and service. They tended the sacred flames that burned continuously in bronze braziers, fed by oils pressed from groves that had been dedicated to religious purposes since the island's founding. The flickering light cast dancing patterns on walls decorated with mosaics that depicted the sea's bounty and the earth's abundance, reminding all who enter the gifts that surrounded their daily lives. Offerings brought to these temples were simple expressions of gratitude rather than attempts to purchase divine favor. Farmers brought the first fruits of their orchards and fields, not from obligation but from a genuine desire to share their joy in another successful harvest. Fishermen dedicated portions of their catch to the gods who govern wind and tide, understanding their prosperity as a partnership rather than a conquest of natural forces. The artisans of the island brought examples of their finest work to be displayed in the temple courtyards, where visitors could admire craftsmanship that had been elevated from mere utility to something approaching art. These offerings remained in the sacred precincts for prescribed periods before being distributed to those in need, ensuring that beauty created in the spirit of devotion eventually found its way into homes throughout the community. Children participated in temple ceremonies with the unconscious grace that came from growing up within traditions that felt as natural as breathing. They carried flower petals to be scattered on altar steps, their voices joining adult choirs and hymns that have been sung in these same chambers for countless generations. The melodies were neither complex nor demanding, designed to include rather than impress, allowing participation from all levels of skill and experience. The temple gardens served as outdoor sanctuaries where meditation and quiet conversation could take place beneath trees whose branches had been trained to create living architecture. Paths wound between pools where sacred fish swam in waters kept clear by springs that bubbled up from deep within the island's foundations. The sound of moving water provided a constant gentle music that helped visitors quiet their minds and open their hearts to whatever wisdom the day might offer. Festivals observed the changing seasons with ceremonies that emphasized continuity and renewal rather than dramatic celebration. The spring ceremony welcomed the return of migrating birds and the first flowering of fruit trees. Summer festivals gave thanks for the long days that ripened grain and warmed the harbor waters. Autumn brought gratitude for harvest abundance, while winter ceremonies honored the necessary rest that preceded each cycle of renewal. During these observances, the entire community participated in processions that moved slowly through the temple precincts and out into the city's main squares. The pace was deliberately unhurried, allowing participants to feel themselves part of tradition that connected them with both ancestors and descendants yet unborn. Incense burned in portable braziers filled the air with fragrances that seemed to sanctify the very atmosphere through which the processions moved. Sacred music played an essential role in these ceremonies, but it was music designed to elevate the spirit, rather than overwhelm the senses. Temple musicians practiced for years to achieve the subtle mastery that made their instruments seem like extensions of their own voices. Harps provided gentle harmonies that supported rather than dominated the congregation's singing, while flutes wove melodies that seemed to rise naturally from the rhythm of communal breathing. The most solemn ceremonies took place at the temple's heart, where a spring of fresh water bubbled up from chambers deep within the island's foundation. This sacred well was said to connect directly with the sources that fed all the island's waterways, making a symbol of the hidden unity that connected every part of their realm. Pilgrims came to drink from this spring and to cast small offerings into its depths, tokens that sank into darkness and mystery. Evening prayers were perhaps the most beautiful of the daily observances, as the last light faded from the sky and temple lamps began their nightly vigil. The prayers were spoken rather than sung, their words carrying across the harbor waters, where they mingled with the sounds of waves against stone quays. Listeners claimed they could hear in these evening devotions an echo of the cosmic harmonies that govern the movement of stars and tides. The temples served not only as places of worship, but as repositories of the island's accumulated wisdom. Sacred libraries preserved scrolls that contained astronomical observations, medical knowledge, and philosophical insights that had been refined across many generations. This knowledge was freely shared with any sincere seeker, whether citizen or foreign visitor, for the priests understood that wisdom increased rather than diminished when it was given away. As night settled over the temple precincts, the sacred flames continued their vigilant burning, their light reflecting in the pools and fountains that adorned every courtyard. Guards walked quiet patrols through gardens where night-blooming flowers released their fragrance in the air that seemed thick with accumulated prayers. The sea kept breathing beyond the harbor walls, its eternal rhythm echoing the steady pulse of devotion that had sustained these sacred places through centuries of peace and prosperity. In the deepest chambers, where only the most dedicated priests and priestesses were permitted to enter, older mysteries were preserved and tended. These were not secrets withheld from people, but rather truths so profound that they required years of preparation to understand properly. Here in silence, broken only by the distant sound of waves and wind, the guardians of sacred knowledge continued their patient work of preserving and transmitting the deepest wisdom their culture had achieved. Neighbors and exchanges, beyond protective ring of mountains that embrace Atlantis, the ocean stretched toward distant shores where other peoples lived their own lives under different stars, guided by their own customs and dreams. The mariners of the island had long ago discovered that the sea, rather than being a barrier, served as a highway connecting all the scattered lands of the earth. Through patient exploration and careful diplomacy, they had established relationships with coastal communities that enriched both their own culture and that of their trading partners. The approach of an Atlantean ship to a foreign harbor was always cause for excitement, as these vessels brought not only exotic goods, but news from across the known world. Their captains served as inadvertent ambassadors, carrying stories and innovations from port to port like seeds scattered by favorable winds. In Egyptian harbors, they spoke of new techniques for working metals. In Mesopotamian river mouths, they shared knowledge of navigation and shipbuilding. Along the coasts of distant Europe, they traded not only goods, but the mathematical concepts that made their architecture possible. The merchants of Atlantis approached these exchanges with a philosophy that emphasized mutual benefit rather than exploitation. They understood that lasting prosperity grew from relationships based on trust and reciprocity, not from the ruthless extraction of profit that would later characterize more aggressive trading empires. Their negotiations proceeded with patience, allowing foreign partners time to consider offers and propose alternatives that might serve everyone's interests more effectively. In the great markets of Memphis, Atlantean traders set up stalls that became centers of wonder and curiosity. They displayed jewelry fashioned from orichalcum that seemed to hold light within its golden depths, pottery glazed with colors that had no names in local languages, and textiles woven from fibers that felt like captured moonbeams. Egyptian merchants examined these marvels with a professional appreciation of people who understood quality, recognizing in these goods the products of a civilization that had achieved mastery over its materials and methods. The exchange was never one-sided, for Atlantis gained as much as it gave in these relationships. From Egypt came papyrus and exotic birds whose brilliant plumage inspired new patterns for textile design. The mathematics and engineering that had enabled the construction of pyramids found new applications in the expanding architecture of the island city. Most valuable of all were the philosophical and religious insights that flowed between cultures, enriching the spiritual life of both communities. In the ports of ancient Greece, Atlantean ships arrived during festivals when the harbors were crowded with vessels from many lands. Here, the island traders encountered philosophers and artists whose ideas about beauty and truth resonated with their own cultural values. Long conversations under waterfront porticos explored questions that had no easy answers, while the exchange of goods proceeded almost as an afterthought to these more profound explorations of human possibility. Greek pottery masters examined Atlantean glazing techniques with intense interest, while island craftsmen marveled at the Greek achievement in marble sculpture and bronze casting. These artistic exchanges produced innovations that appeared simultaneously in widely separated lands, as techniques learned in one culture were adapted and refined in another, then carried by traders to yet more distant shores. The northern routes took Atlantean vessels to lands where amber washed up on storm-swept beaches, and where craftsmen worked in metals unknown to southern civilizations. The barbarian tribes of these cold shores possessed their own forms of wisdom, particularly in the working of iron and the preservation of food through long winters. Their warriors' weapons showed a practical understanding of metallurgy that complemented the more decorative approaches favored in warmer climates. These northern peoples welcomed Atlantean traders with feasts that lasted for days, their generosity reflecting cultural values that prize hospitality above personal accumulation around fires that burned. Throughout the night, Stories were shared that revealed common themes despite the vast differences in language and custom. The sea figured in the legends of all coastal peoples, and the Atlanteans found familiar elements in tales told beneath foreign stars. To the south, beyond the known coast of Africa, lay lands where spices grew that could transform the simplest meal into a feast of senses. The journey to these tropical ports required months at sea, but the rewards justified the risks. Cinnamon and pepper, unknown fruits that lasted for weeks without spoiling, and medicinal plants whose properties have been discovered through centuries of careful observation, all found their way into Atlantean ships' holds. These southern expeditions also brought back knowledge of astronomical phenomena visible only from equatorial latitudes. The island scholars incorporated these observations into their understanding of celestial mechanics, refining their ability to predict eclipses and seasonal changes. The mathematical concepts needed to process this information flowed both ways as southern astronomers gained new tools for their own observations. The diplomatic relationships that grew from these trading connections operated on principles that modern nations might find surprisingly sophisticated. Disputes were resolved through patient negotiation rather than force, with each side recognizing that their long-term interests lay in maintaining peaceful exchanges. Ambassadors from Atlantis were trained not only in languages and customs, but in the subtle arts of finding common ground between communities with different values and priorities. These diplomatic missions often resulted in cultural exchanges that went far beyond commercial agreements. Young people from allied communities spent years in Atlantis learning island techniques and perspectives while contributing their own knowledge to their host's understanding. Similarly, Atlantean scholars and craftsmen established temporary residences in foreign lands, creating networks of personal relationships that made future cooperation more likely and more productive. The language of trade developed its own vocabulary and grammar, drawing elements from all the cultures that participated in these exchanges. This maritime lingua franca enabled communication between peoples who share no common ancestry or religious beliefs, creating a medium through which ideas could flow as freely as goods. Words for mathematical concepts, artistic techniques, and philosophical insights cross cultural boundaries, enriching all the languages they entered. As years passed into decades and decades into centuries, these relationships deepened and evolved. What had begun as simple exchanges of goods became complex webs of mutual dependence and shared knowledge. The prosperity of Atlantis became intertwined with that of its trading partners, creating a network of interdependence that helped maintain peace across vast reaches of the ancient world. The sea kept breathing between all these scattered shores, its tides carrying ships laden with goods and ideas to ports where different peoples waited with their own treasures to share. In harbor towns around the Mediterranean and beyond, the arrival of spring brought anticipation of the trading season ahead, when the ocean highways would once again link distant lands in the ancient dance of exchange that had enriched human civilization since the first brave sailors had ventured beyond the sight of familiar coasts. The living earth, deep beneath the terraced gardens and marble palaces of Atlantis, forces older than human memory, continued their patient work of shaping the world. The island existed because of these powers, born from the slow collision of vast plates of stone that moved beneath the ocean floor like sleeping giants, occasionally stirring in their dreams. The people who walked the surface understood themselves to be temporary guests in a realm governed by processes that operated on scales of time that dwarfed their brief generations. The mountains that formed the island's protective backbone bore witness to this ancient creativity. Their slopes revealed layers of rock that told stories stretching back millions of years, each stratum a page in the Earth's long autobiography. Volcanic peaks rose above the tree line, their summits crowned with snow that fed the springs and streams flowing down to nourish the inhabited districts below. These heights reminded all who looked upon them that their prosperity depended upon forces they could influence but never truly control. Hot springs bubbled up throughout the island, their waters carrying dissolved minerals from deep. Chambers where stone slowly yielded its treasures to patient pressure and heat. The Atlanteans had learned to channel these thermal sources into public baths and heating systems that made their buildings comfortable even during the coolest months. The springs themselves became gathering places where citizens could relax in naturally heated pools while discussing the day's events or simply contemplating the wonder of living water emerging from hidden depths. The warm waters were believed to possess healing properties, and people traveled from distant lands to bathe in pools that seemed to ease both physical ailments and spiritual troubles. The mineral content of each spring created unique combinations of taste and supposed effect, with some favor for treating joint pain, others for skin conditions, and still others for the indefinable malaise that could afflict the human spirit when separated too long from nature's embrace. The island scholars maintained careful records of seismic activity, not from fear, but from practical wisdom of people who understood their environment. They had developed instruments that could detect the subtle tremors that preceded larger movements, and they knew how to read the signs that nature provided when the earth prepared to shift. Changes in spring water temperatures, unusual animal behavior, and the appearance of gases seeping from rock fissures all formed part of vocabulary that allowed them to anticipate geological events. This knowledge was not kept secret, but shared freely throughout the population for the safety of all. Depended upon everyone's ability to recognize warning signs and respond appropriately. Children learn alongside their lessons in reading and mathematics to observe the natural world with attention and respect. They were taught that the earth was a living entity deserving of gratitude and care, not a collection of resources to be exploited without thought for consequences. The volcanic soils that covered much of the island were extraordinarily fertile, capable of supporting crops, and gardens that astonished visitors from lands where agriculture required constant struggle against barren ground and uncertain weather. The Atlanteans understood this fertility as a gift that imposed responsibilities as well as benefits. They practiced farming methods that preserved and enhanced the soil's richness rather than exhausting it for short-term gain. Crop rotation followed patterns that had been refined through generations of careful observation. Fields that grew grain one season will be planted with legumes the next, allowing beneficial bacteria to restore nitrogen to the soil. Areas too steep for cultivation were maintained as forests whose roots helped prevent erosion while providing timber for construction and fuel for heating. Every aspect of land use reflected an understanding that present prosperity depended upon maintaining conditions that would sustain future generations. The relationship between the Atlanteans and their environment extended beyond mere practical considerations to encompass something approaching reverence. They saw themselves as participants in natural cycles rather than masters, standing apart from the processes that sustain life. This perspective influenced everything from architecture, design to work, with prevailing winds and weather patterns too. City planning that preserved natural drainage and left space for wildlife corridors. Gardens throughout the island were designed as collaborations between human intention and natural processes rather than imposing geometric patterns that ignored topography and climate. Atlantean gardeners worked with existing landforms to create spaces that appear both designed and wild. Water features followed natural drainage patterns, while plant selections emphasized species that thrived in local conditions without requiring constant intervention. The mining of orichalcum and other valuable materials proceeded according to principles that balanced human needs with environmental preservation. Shafts and galleries were designed to minimize disruption to underground water sources, while surface operations were restored to productive use once deposits were exhausted. The Atlanteans understood that their unique metals were finite resources whose extraction required careful planning and restraint. Sacred groves scattered throughout the island served as reminders that some areas must remain untouched by human activity. These protected forests provided refuge for wildlife and served as living laboratories where natural processes could continue without interference. The oldest trees in these groves were thought to possess wisdom accumulated through centuries of quiet observation, and people came to sit among their roots when seeking clarity about difficult decisions. The island's wildlife had adapted to coexistence with human inhabitants over many generations. Dolphins played in harbor waters without fear of the ships that passed overhead, while seabirds nested on rooftops and in garden trees. The Atlanteans took pride in this harmony, seeing it as evidence that conscious beings could enhance rather than diminish the beauty of their surroundings when they acted with sufficient wisdom and restraint. Seasonal changes brought their own rhythms to this relationship between human culture and natural processes. Spring earthquakes, usually minor, were understood as the Earth's way of adjusting to new growth and changing water levels. Summer droughts tested the island's water management systems, while winter storms demonstrated the importance of flexible construction methods that could accommodate natural forces rather than simply resist them. The Atlanteans developed technologies that worked with rather than against natural processes. Their harbor designs used natural rock formations and tidal patterns to create protected anchorages that required minimal maintenance. Water distribution systems followed gravity wherever possible, reducing the need for pumps and mechanical devices that might fail during emergencies. Building techniques emphasized materials and methods that would age gracefully, becoming more beautiful rather than less. So as decades passed, even their arts reflected this integration with natural processes. Pottery incorporated volcanic ash that gave glazes their unique colors, while textiles were dyed with pigments extracted from local plants and minerals. Musical instruments were crafted from woods that had grown in island forests, their tonal qualities reflecting the specific growing conditions that had shaped each tree. The very sounds of Atlantean music carried echoes of the wind patterns and rainfall that influenced the materials from which their instruments were made. As night settled over the island, the thermal springs continued their ancient work of bringing Earth's deep warmth to the surface. In pools scattered throughout the city, citizens soaked in water that had begun its journey in chambers far below, heated by processes that connected their small island to the vast forces that shaped entire continents. Steam rose into the cool night air like visible prayers, carrying with it the mineral essence of deep rock and the eternal mystery of water's transformation. The sea kept breathing around their shores, its tides responding to gravitational forces that operated across the solar system in this rhythm. The Atlanteans found confirmation of their understanding that all existence was interconnected, from the smallest tide pool creature to the distant stars that guided there, navigators across trackless waters. Their island was both unique and universal, a particular expression of principles that govern the entire cosmos. The long night of change. The seasons turned as they always had. But gradually the people of Atlantis began to notice subtle differences in patterns that had remained constant for centuries. The changes came slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, like the way afternoon shadows lengthened so gradually that only careful observers marked the daily progression toward evening. Springs that had always run clear began to carry traces of sediment, while others that had bubbled with consistent force started to flow with irregular rhythms. The island scholars noted these variations in their careful records, comparing current observations with measurements their predecessors had maintained across generations. Water levels in the sacred wells fluctuated beyond their normal ranges, sometimes rising higher than anyone could remember, sometimes dropping to depths that revealed stone foundations no living person had ever seen. The priests who tended the temple spring spoke quietly among themselves about these changes, offering additional prayers while maintaining the calm demeanor that had always characterized their service. In the mountains, shepherds reported that certain high pastures had become waterlogged, while others that had always been lush began to show patches of unusual dryness. Rock falls, once rare events that occurred only during the heaviest storms, became more frequent, and some of the thermal springs that had provided healing waters for countless generations began to emit unfamiliar odors that suggested changes in their deep sources. The harbor pilots noticed alterations in the tidal patterns that had guided their work since childhood. Channels that had remained stable for decades began to shift their depths and directions, requiring new charts and constant vigilance to ensure safe passage for visiting ships. Some of the smaller islands in the outer harbor experienced changes in their shorelines, with familiar landmarks disappearing beneath rising waters while new rocks emerged in unexpected places. These observations were discussed in the council chambers where the island's leaders gathered to consider matters of common concern. The conversations proceeded with the same measured deliberation that characterized all important decisions in Atlantis, without panic or precipitous action, but with the serious attention due to matters that affected the entire community. Some counselors suggested that these changes represented natural variations that had probably occurred before in the island's long history, while others wondered if human activities might be influencing the delicate balance that had sustained their prosperity. The miners who worked the orichalcum deposits reported that some of the deeper shafts had begun to fill with water that seeped through rock that had previously been dry. The water was warm and carried dissolved minerals that created new colors in the metal they extracted, producing alloys with properties that required experimentation to understand fully. Some of these new variations proved even more beautiful than the traditional orichalcum, while others were too brittle for the uses that had made the island's metalwork famous throughout the known world. Farmers in the outer districts observed that some of their fields had become more productive than ever, while others struggled with drainage problems that made planting difficult. The changes seemed to follow no pattern that human understanding could decipher, affecting neighboring plots differently and creating a patchwork of abundance and challenge that required constant adaptation. The agricultural Knowledge that had been passed down through generations needed revision as traditional methods proved inadequate to new conditions. The great lighthouse continued its nightly vigil, but its keepers noticed that atmospheric conditions were affecting the beam's visibility in ways they had never observed before. Some nights, the light seemed to carry farther than usual, visible to ships that should have been beyond its normal range. Other evenings, fog and unusual cloud formations restricted its reach, requiring additional signal fires to maintain safe navigation around the island's approaches. Sea life in the harbor waters began to display different behaviors, with some species becoming more abundant while others seemed to seek deeper or more distant waters. The dolphins that had long delighted children and visitors with their playful presence became less predictable in their movements, sometimes appearing in greater numbers than anyone could remember, other times absent for days or weeks at a time. Fishermen adapted their methods to these changes, following the fish to new grounds, while maintaining the sustainable practices that had preserved the ocean's bounty for previous generations. The sacred pools in the temple precincts experienced variations that troubled the priests who had served them for decades. Water that had always maintained constant temperatures began to fluctuate, sometimes growing warmer than usual, occasionally cooling to levels that required additional heating to maintain the comfortable conditions worshippers expected. The fish that lived in these pools showed signs of stress, and their numbers declined despite efforts to maintain their traditional care. As months passed into years, the pattern of changes became more pronounced, though still gradual, enough that daily life continued much as it always had. Children played in streets that remained familiar, even as the water levels in nearby canals slowly shifted. Markets continued to bustle with commerce, though some of the traditional goods became more difficult to obtain, while others appeared in greater abundance than before. The island artists found inspiration in these transformations, creating works that captured the subtle beauty of a world in transition. Painters depicted landscapes that seemed to shimmer with an inner life, as if the very rocks and trees were aware of the changes flowing through them. Musicians composed melodies that echoed the new rhythms they heard in wind and wave, while poets found words for experiences that had no precedent in their inherited vocabulary. Through all these gradual transformations, the people of Atlantis maintained the grace and wisdom that had always characterized their culture. They adapted to changing conditions without losing their essential values, helping neighbors who faced difficulties while celebrating those who found unexpected opportunities in the shifting environment. Community gatherings continued to provide forums where concerns could be voiced and solutions explored through collective consideration. The nights grew longer and the days shorter, though whether this represented seasonal variation or something more fundamental remained unclear to observers who had only human lifespans against which to measure such changes. The stars seemed to burn with unusual intensity, while the moon's reflection on the harbor waters created patterns that reminded older citizens of configurations they had seen in childhood but thought forgotten. In the deepest chambers beneath the temples, the most ancient texts were consulted for any wisdom they might contain about such transformations. These scrolls, written in languages that few could read, and preserved through centuries of careful guardianship, spoke of cycles longer than individual lives or even the rise and fall of dynasties. They suggested that change was the natural state of the world, and that wisdom lay not in resisting transformation, but in maintaining virtue and compassion while adapting to whatever conditions the earth might present. The sea kept breathing around the island's shores, its rhythm unchanging even as the land it embraced underwent its slow metamorphosis. In that eternal pulse, the Atlanteans found comfort in continuity, a reminder that some patterns endure regardless of surface changes, and that their island's destiny remained intertwined with forces greater than any human understanding could encompass. Sailors' memories. In the years that followed the great changes, when the waters had finally settled into new patterns and the sea had claimed what would claim, the survivors carried with them memories that seemed too beautiful to be entirely real, scattered across the Mediterranean and beyond, on shores where they had found refuge. The former inhabitants of the lost island spoke in hushed voices of the home they would never see again, their words heavy with the weight of wonders that existed now only in remembrance. Lysander, who had been a harbor pilot in the Outer Ring, found himself in a fishing village on the coast of what would one day be called Spain. He worked mending nets and teaching local fishermen the navigation techniques he had learned in deeper waters. But in the evenings when the day's work was done, he would sit by driftwood fires and speak of harbors where the water had been so clear you could see coins glinting on the bottom 20 feet below, and of lighthouse beams that could guide ships safely through storms that would have destroyed vessels navigating by any other light. The local fishermen listened with the patient attention that seamen give to tales of waters they have never sailed, understanding that truth often lived in stories that sounded impossible to land-bound ears. They noticed how Lysander's eyes grew distant when he spoke of the great breakwater that had protected his harbor, constructed from stones so perfectly fitted that no mortar was needed to hold them in place, and of the bronze mechanisms that had raised and lowered chain barriers to control access to the inner ports. In Alexandria, Artemisia worked as a scribe in the great library, her skill with languages making her valuable to scholars who studied texts from many lands. But her fellow scribes knew her best for the mathematical treatises she copied from memory, formulas for calculating volumes and angles that her teachers in Atlantis had passed down through generations of builders and architects. She drew diagrams that showed how weight could be distributed through stone structures to create buildings that would stand for centuries, and her explanations of hydraulic principles helped engineers design aqueducts that supplied water to growing cities. When younger scribes asked about the source of her knowledge, Artemisia would describe workshops where master craftsmen had worked alongside apprentices for decades, refining techniques that balanced strength with beauty, durability with elegance. She spoke of guild halls where the accumulated wisdom of centuries was preserved not in scrolls, but in the patient demonstration of hands that had learned their craft through years of practice, and where innovations were tested and refined through community discussion before being adopted into general use. On the island of Crete, where Minoan traders had long welcomed ships from across the sea, an old merchant named Demetrios established a trading house that became famous for the fairness of its dealings and the quality of its goods. He had been a cloth merchant in Atlantis, and though he could no longer obtain the unique fibers that had made his previous fortune, he applied the principles of honest commerce and mutual benefit that he had learned in his homeland's markets. Demetrios trained local weavers in techniques for creating patterns that seemed to shift and flow as light struck them from different angles, though the results could never match the lustrous textiles that had been woven from plants that grew only in Atlantean soil. He established trade relationships based on trust and long-term thinking rather than immediate profit, creating networks of exchange that enriched all participants and earned him a reputation that drew customers from across the eastern Mediterranean. In the ports of Cyprus, where copper had been mined since ancient times, Atlantean metalworkers shared their knowledge of alloys and tempering techniques with local craftsmen who had worked bronze for generations, though they could never reproduce orichalcum without access to unique ores that had been found only in their lost homeland. They developed new combinations of metals that possessed their own distinctive properties and beauty. These collaborations produced innovations that influenced metalworking throughout the region as Cypriot bronze began to incorporate techniques that had been refined through centuries of experimentation in Atlantean workshops. The curved lines and flowing forms that characterized island metalwork appeared in weapons and tools, jewelry and architectural fittings, carrying forward aesthetic principles that honor both function and beauty. Along the North African coast, in ports where Atlantean ships have been welcomed for generations, former sea captains established navigation schools where they taught the mathematical principles that had guided their vessels across trackless waters. They drew charts from memory, showing the relationships between star positions and seasonal weather patterns, wind currents, and the behavior of seabirds that could reveal the presence of distant land. Their students learned to read the subtle signs that reveal the ocean's moods and intentions. They studied the way waves reflected off underwater obstacles, how the color of water changed above reefs and shallows, and how the flight patterns of different bird species could provide information about wind, direction, and the proximity of fresh water. These techniques, refined through generations of practice in the challenging waters around Atlantis, were adapted to local conditions and passed on to new generations of mariners. In the mountain valleys of Asia Minor, where Atlantean scholars had found refuge after the great changes, libraries were established that preserved not only texts but the methods of inquiry that had flourished in their homeland's academies. These schools became centers of learning that attracted students from across the region, drawn by teaching methods that emphasized observation and experimentation alongside traditional scholarship. The curricula developed in these refugee institutions integrated mathematics and natural philosophy, astronomy and engineering, in ways that reflected the holistic approach to knowledge that had characterized Atlantean education. Students learned to see connections between seemingly unrelated subjects, understanding that advances in one field often provided insights that illuminated problems in others. This interdisciplinary approach produced innovations that influenced Greek philosophy, Egyptian engineering, and the development of mathematical concepts throughout the Mediterranean world. As decades passed, the children and grandchildren of Atlantean refugees grew up as citizens of their adopted lands. But the stories and skills inherited from their ancestors continued to influence their new communities. The principles of civic harmony and environmental stewardship that had guided island society were adapted to different conditions and challenges, creating pockets of innovation and cooperation that served as examples for neighboring regions. The memory of Atlantis became more than nostalgia for a lost homeland. It evolved into an ideal that inspired efforts to create better communities wherever the survivors and their descendants made their homes. The practical knowledge they carried with them proved valuable, but perhaps even more important were the values and perspectives that had shaped their approach to common challenges. Maritime festivals in ports around the Mediterranean began to include ceremonies honoring the memory of the lost island celebrating not only its material achievements, but the principles that had made its prosperity possible. These observances emphasize a connection between human welfare and environmental health, the importance of international cooperation, and the value of preserving knowledge for future generations. The sea kept breathing around all these scattered shores, connecting the refugee communities with the same rhythms that had once lapped against the harbors of their lost homeland. In its endless circulation, the ocean carried stories and memories from port to port, ensuring that the legacy of Atlantis would continue to influence human civilization long after the island itself had been claimed by the waves. The tides that had once filled Atlantean canals now touched beaches where former citizens watched the same stars they had observed from temple courtyards, finding in celestial constancy some comfort for terrestrial loss. Seekers through ages, in the centuries that followed the disappearance of the great island, the story of Atlantis became something more than memory. It transformed into a vision that drew seekers from every generation to search for traces of the lost realm. Scholars pored over ancient texts, looking for clues that might reveal the island's location, while explorers ventured into uncharted waters, hoping to find ruins that could prove the legend's truth. Each age interpreted the tale according to its own understanding, finding in Atlantis a mirror for contemporary dreams and fears. Medieval monks, copying ancient manuscripts by candlelight in scriptoriums throughout Europe, preserved Plato's account alongside other classical texts that had survived the collapse of Rome. They understood Atlantis as a moral fable, a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride and the consequences of turning away from divine guidance. In illuminated margins, they drew miniature islands surrounded by stylized waves, their artistic interpretations reflecting medieval assumptions about geography and divine judgment. Renaissance scholars, newly enthusiastic about classical learning, read the Atlantis story with eyes trained to look for historical truth beneath allegorical surfaces. They compared Plato's description with accounts of newly discovered lands in the Americas, wondering whether European explorers might have found fragments of the lost continent. Maps from this period sometimes included speculative islands in the Atlantic, placed according to various theories about where Atlantis might have been located. The great libraries of Florence and Venice became centers for debates about the island's reality, with humanist philosophers arguing about the reliability of ancient sources and the proper methods for interpreting texts that mixed historical claims with philosophical instruction. Some scholars insisted that Plato had invented Atlantis purely to illustrate political points, while others maintained that such detailed descriptions must have been based on genuine traditions about a real place. As European exploration expanded knowledge of world geography, theories about Atlantis evolved to accommodate new information about ocean depths and continental formations. Navigators who had sailed across the Atlantic reported soundings that suggested submerged land masses, while natural historians began to understand that sea levels had changed dramatically over geological time. These discoveries provided scientific frameworks that made the submersion of a large island seem plausible, rather than fantastic. In the 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers approached the Atlantis question with systematic methodology, applying the same rational analysis they used for other historical problems. They compiled lists of similarities between Plato's description and various ancient civilizations, looking for correlations that might indicate which real culture had inspired the philosopher's account. Some suggested that Atlantis represented a confused memory of Minoan Crete, while others pointed to similarities with Egyptian or Mesopotamian civilizations. The Romantic movement of the 19th century brought new emotional resonance to the Atlantis story, with poets and artists creating works that emphasize the tragedy of lost beauty rather than the moral lessons that had interested earlier interpreters. Paintings depicted the last moments of the doomed island, with classical temples sinking beneath storm-tossed waves, while noble inhabitants faced their fate with stoic dignity. These artistic interpretations helped establish Atlantis as a symbol of vanished golden ages and humanity's yearning for perfection. Archaeological discoveries throughout the Mediterranean provided tantalizing glimpses of advanced, ancient civilizations that had indeed been destroyed by natural disasters. The excavation of Pompeii revealed a sophisticated urban culture preserved by volcanic catastrophe, while the uncovering of Minoan palaces on Crete showed that Bronze Age societies had achieved levels of artistic and technological development that exceeded many people's expectations about the ancient world. These findings encouraged more systematic searches for Atlantean remains. Underwater archaeologists developed techniques for exploring submerged sites, discovering harbors and buildings that had been claimed by rising sea levels over millennia. While none of these discoveries provided definitive proof of Atlantis, they demonstrated that the ocean did indeed conceal the remains of human settlements, making the basic premise of the legend more credible to scientific minds. The 20th century brought both more sophisticated search methods and more diverse interpretations of what researchers might be seeking. Sonar mapping revealed previously unknown features of the ocean floor, including underwater mountain ranges and deep basins that could have been islands or inland seas during periods of lower sea level. Plate tectonic theory provided mechanisms by which land masses could rise or sink over geological time, offering scientific explanations for how an island like Atlantis might actually disappear. At the same time, anthropological studies of oral traditions showed how stories of catastrophic floods and lost homelands appeared in cultures around the world, suggesting that the Atlantis legend might preserve genuine memories of prehistoric disasters. Geologists identified evidence of massive tsunamis and volcanic eruptions that had affected Mediterranean civilizations, providing historical precedents for the kind of sudden destruction that Plato had described. Modern expeditions have searched for Atlantis in locations ranging from the Mediterranean to the Caribbean, from the North Sea to the coast of Spain. Each search has been guided by different interpretations of the ancient accounts and different assumptions about how literally the descriptions should be taken. Some explorers have focused on finding monumental architecture that would match Plato's description of concentric rings and massive harbors, while others have looked for evidence of advanced metallurgy or unusual agricultural techniques. The advent of satellite imagery and computer modeling has allowed researchers to simulate ancient coastlines and search for anomalous features that might indicate human construction. Underwater robots have explored deep-sea locations that would have been impossible to reach with earlier technology, while ground-penetrating radar has revealed buried structures at sites where Atlantis enthusiasts believe the island might have existed. Yet despite centuries of searching, no discovery has definitively proven the historical existence of Atlantis, as Plato described it. This lack of physical evidence has not diminished the legend's appeal, but has instead allowed it to evolve into something more flexible and enduring than any mere archaeological site could provide. Atlantis has become a repository for humanity's dreams about what civilization might achieve under ideal conditions, a standard against which real societies can measure their accomplishments and aspirations. In literature and popular culture, Atlantis continues to serve as a setting for stories about advanced technologies, enlightened governance, and harmonious relationships between human society and the natural world. Science fiction writers have reimagined the island as the home of underwater civilizations, or the launching point for spacefaring cultures. Environmental activists have cited Atlantean ideals as models for sustainable development, while political theorists have analyzed Plato's description for insights about democratic institutions and social organization. The search for Atlantis has also become a metaphor for the broader human quest to understand our past and to recover wisdom that might have been lost through historical catastrophes. Museums display artifacts from various ancient civilizations under banners asking whether these might be remnants of Atlantean culture, while documentaries explore the possibility that advanced prehistoric societies might have achieved knowledge that was later forgotten during dark ages of war and social collapse. Contemporary seekers approach Atlantis with tools that Plato could never have imagined, from DNA analysis of ancient populations to computer simulations of prehistoric climate patterns. Yet their motivations remain fundamentally similar to those of philosophers' original students: a desire to understand how human societies can flourish, what causes civilizations to fail, and whether it might be possible to create communities that combine material prosperity with spiritual fulfillment. The sea keeps breathing over all the locations where Atlantis has been sought, its tides covering and uncovering shores that have witnessed human hopes and disappointments across millennia of searching. Whether the island ever existed as a physical place may matter less than the fact that its story continues to inspire efforts to build better societies and to preserve the knowledge and values that make human civilization worthwhile. In this sense, Atlantis lives not in any particular location beneath the waves, but in the continuing aspiration to create communities worthy of the dreams that have kept its memory alive. And so our long journey through the story of Atlantis draws to its peaceful close, like a ship returning to harbor after months at sea. We have wandered together through ancient gardens where impossible flowers bloomed, walked beside canals that reflected stars and lantern light. Listen to the gentle voices of craftsmen and scholars, mariners and seekers, all united by their connection to this island that lives, now only in memory and dream. The tide is ebbing now, carrying our thoughts back towards sleep and rest. Let your breathing slow too. Match the rhythm of waves against distant shores, where the sea continues its eternal conversation with the land, somewhere in that vast blue expanse, whether in hidden depths or in the realm of pure imagination. Atlantis continues its quiet existence, waiting for dreamers who understand that the most important truths often cannot be measured or mapped, but only felt by hearts that remain open to wonder. The lamp beside your bed grows dim, and outside your window, the night holds all the stories we have, shared in its gentle embrace. Tomorrow there will be other tales to tell, other wonders to explore, but tonight belongs to the peaceful island where wisdom and beauty walked hand in hand, where the sea kept breathing in perfect rhythm with human hearts that had learned to live in harmony with the world around them. Close your eyes now and let the soft sound of those eternal tides carry you toward the rest that awaits all seekers who have journeyed far in search of truth and beauty. The sea keeps breathing, and in its rhythm we find the lullaby that has comforted countless generations before us. and will sing the same gentle song to countless generations yet to come. Sleep well and dream of islands where the light never fails and the stories never end.